Strength, dexterity, and constitution, the three main non-magic combat stats.
But which is the most important in a real sword fight?
Strength, the stat that determines how hard you hit and how big of a weapon you get to use.
This is the primary stat for barbarians, fighters, people who like to get in close and hit really hard.
So the more strength you have, the more damage you do with the sword, right?
Not quite.
Do I have to keep wearing this outfit for the rest of this bit?
Yeah, for the viewers.
The first thing we have to talk about is the misconception that the sword is a strength-based weapon.
These only weigh 3 pounds. They're not that heavy.
Swords don't rely on smashing into your opponent. They rely on having the correct edge alignment and on having the correct structure behind the cut. So watch this. That was a pretty big attack. It had some power behind it, but now watch this. Arguably, that was a more powerful attack. And let's be honest here. Sorry, Clark. I got a little bit more muscle than you do.
A little bit.
What Clark just did was a more powerful attack for a number of different reasons. When you watch my attack, look at how disconnected my body is from my structure. Everything here is disconnected. What I am relying on with this is a little bit of the muscles in my lats and the muscles in my triceps to swing this down with a little bit of my core. Coming from here, it's a smashing attack. But what Clark did...
A good structured cut uses what's called the kinetic chain. And what that is using your whole body to accomplish one task. It starts at the feet, into the knees, into the hips, through the core, the arms, and the shoulders, with the weight of the body behind it, all doing that one cut.
So now that you've seen both, you can tell the difference between this big wind-up cut that only recruits a couple muscles and a proper cut that has the entire force of the body behind it plus structure. The second part of this equation is structure. When we're talking about structure in a sword fight, what we're talking about is the ability to comport our body in such a way that we are strong using our skeleton, not just muscling something. So here's an experiment you can do at home to understand the difference between structure and muscling something. Muscling something is just trying to push all of your muscles one direction and not really using your bones and your skeleton to align yourself. So here's what you're gonna do. First, start with your arm like this, and your friend's gonna try and bend your arm to your shoulder. Don't hurt each other. So he's gonna go, and what I'm gonna try and do first is I'm gonna try and press as hard as I can down. I'm thinking resist with my muscles. Go ahead. I can't do it. And I'm pretty buff.
Stronger than I am.
Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna think about structure. Now instead of pressing down like this, I'm thinking about reaching out. Here we go. I'm using my structure. Now, instead of just thinking about pushing down like this and only recruiting one muscle, I'm also recruiting more muscles and I'm pushing my arm out into a position where it's very strong. This is how we utilize structure in a sword fight. The last thing we're gonna talk about before we move on is diminishing returns.
You need a baseline level of strength to effectively use a sword. But once you hit that point, you don't really need much more beyond that.
That doesn't mean you shouldn't go to the gym and get buff. It's fun, you should do it, it's good for your health. But there's a point at which your strength isn't actually helping you hit any harder or any better. Watch this. That's about as hard as I can hit with this sword. When I'm using good structure and I'm using a snapping cut and I'm not overdoing it. Now listen to how hard Clark hits. Effectively, it's about the same. That's because these weapons don't rely on strength, it's about structure and edge alignment. So how much power do you actually need to cut with the sword? Well, we have a soaked tatami roll and a sword, so let's figure this out. You don't really need a lot of power. All I did was an extension and a turn of the hips. So I'm not actually an expert test cutter. I'm good at cutting, but there are people who train specifically to cut with as little power and as much precision as they can. But knowing that, let's see how small of a cut can I make.
You're smaller.
Smaller. I don't think I can. No, that was too small, but it went almost all the way through and all I did was turn my hips. Let's see if I can just snap it. Nah, snap cuts are not quite as powerful. It still went
over halfway through.
Let's see, it still went that deep in with nothing but a snap cut. Yeah, you're not holding a sword anymore. When you consider like what do you need to cut with, are we trying to cut through something or are we trying to cut to disable? But here is a super basic cut. And it goes through, like I didn't even overpower that. The follow through just happened because there's no more resistance. Yeah. You don't need a lot of power. I could hit harder if I wanted to, but it would slow things down, it would mess up my edge alignment, and it really wouldn't affect anything at the end because as you saw earlier, it doesn't really matter how hard you hit with the sword. These cut really well when you have good edge alignment. But what about if I'm fighting an opponent and I need to overpower them? Having more muscle is definitely gonna help in that situation, right?
This is what goes back to structure instead of strength. Having strength will help you leverage that, but structure is way more important in the bind.
Now, we're not gonna lie to you and say if you have tiny baby noodle arms, it's gonna be super easy to do this. You need to have some muscle to wield this thing effectively. But once you have that baseline of muscle, instead of thinking about pressing my opponent's sword down, which is actually bad and gives him a lot of time to flee the bind and hurt me, I want to think about using my structure that we talked about earlier to put him in a position where he can't resist me. It doesn't matter how strong he is, how hard he presses, he will not win. And the same thing for him. If he gets me in a position where he's strong, I am stronger than Clark. I am a lot stronger than Clark. I am not pressing him to the side.
Not gonna happen.
It doesn't matter because he has a superior position, and basic brute force kind of falls off at that point.
Yeah.
The reason for this comes down to leverage, angles, and position. When we're talking about strength, it has to do with the way we move our body and have our body facing, but it also has to do with where our levers are.
Every sword has a strong and a weak. Basically what this means, if we're weak to weak, it's pretty neutral. It's any man's game. This is when strength can help. If we're strong to strong, it's the same thing. Where it changes is using the leverage of the sword to your advantage. If my strong is on his weak, no amount of force from him will move me, and I can move him with very little effort.
I'm so beauty!
In that same vein, if my weak is on his strong, I will never move him, whereas I am utterly at his mercy because leverage and structure is what really matters in the bind.
The other thing that we want to think about is the angle. If we're here, neither of us has the advantage because both of us are pointing straight at the other person. But if I come into this position, I have an advantage. My sword's on the inside and it's facing towards him, and I'm locking him out in a position where he's not very strong. From here, he can press as hard as he wants to, even if we're in a neutral bind, but because I'm pointed this way and I've broken his structure, he's not gonna win. But what about power attacks, you ask? So the idea that I can do a really big attack and blow through his parry, or that he's gonna do a big attack and I'm so strong I can stop his parry no matter what. Well, this also kind of doesn't make sense because it comes back to structure like we talked about before. I can attack Clark as hard as I want to, and if he has a good structured parry that uses his skeleton to stop this, it doesn't matter. I am never gonna get through that.
In the same vein, even though David is a lot stronger than I am, if he has a badly structured parry, I can blow through it with relative ease. For example,
I didn't stand a chance, and I was really trying.
dexterity, the ability to dodge, dip, duck, dive, and dodge through the battlefield.
Rogues, rangers, and monks are primarily the ones who use dexterity as their attack stat, but not only that, they use it to style on their opponents while they're doing that. Sick backflips, cool dodges. The higher your dexterity score is, the cooler the you can do, right?
Not really.
A lot of people see dexterity as the skill that lets them maneuver their character around, doing sick flips, cartwheels, and acts of agility. And this isn't really what happens in a sword fight. As you probably know, trying to do a backflip in a sword fight's a bad idea, but that doesn't mean it's not cool in cinema.
What dexterity does in a real sword fight is the ability to move your body and your sword.
The first and most obvious application of dexterity is the ability to move your body in space. For instance, the ability to get in and out quickly on an attack. It's also really good for evasive techniques.
But not like you see in Hollywood and video games. It's not about rolling out of the way of your opponent's cut.
Instead, it's smaller actions that leave you open to make a quick riposte.
Dexterity is also about point control, the ability to get your point exactly where you want it.
There's also a lot of deceptive things you can do with your blade if you're dexterous. For instance, you can disengage from one line to cut to another line. You can disengage your opponent's taker action. You can feint by indicating in one line and switching to another line, and a number of different actions, but you have to have good dexterity with your hand. Unlike what D&D and other RPGs might lead you to believe, dexterity isn't reserved for only the small weapons that are dex-based. The longsword requires a lot of dexterity.
There are a lot of cuts and techniques with the longsword that require a lot of dexterity, such as the mutirin or the duplirin.
The same deceptive blade work we saw with the other swords can be used here. We have Durchwechsel, we have Zucken, we have all sorts of ways to move our opponent's sword away, and they require hand dexterity and timing. And this brings us to something else, Fühlen. We think of these longswords as big, smashy, strength-based weapons, but really they are dexterity-based weapons, and one of the things we need to do when we're doing them is have a lot of feeling in the blade. The ability to sense when my opponent is strengthening or weakening so I can choose the appropriate action. And you can only do this if you have excellent hand dexterity and feeling. But what about when it comes to attacking? In video games and in D&D, you can attack with dexterity. Earlier we saw how you attack with structure and strength. How does it look to attack with dexterity? Well, it looks like this. Instead of trying to focus on the chain of the body and structure to pull through and do massive damage, we're worried about getting the sword out very quickly. This is a snap cut, and it still does have good structure behind it, but we're using it differently. Instead of coming up and pulling through, now we're pushing forward and we are punching into the target. This is incredibly fast, and it's still pretty powerful and pretty deadly. If I hit someone in the head with this, it's probably the end of the fight.
The same thing applies with the longsword. You can do your structured cut, or you can do a quicker snap cut. You won't cut your opponent in twain, but you don't really need to, especially if you're targeting the head or the hands.
Constitution!
The ability to wade through the battlefield, tanking hits to protect your squishy mages.
Paladins, fighters, and other heavily armored tank characters use their constitution to soak up punishment from the enemy, drawing aggro away from the squishy DPS people so they can do their damage.
It also lets you fight all day and all night for 3 days straight and never run out of gas.
Except, not really. A lot of people think of Constitution as your ability to soak up damage, to take a hit and keep on going. But when it comes to swords, that just really isn't possible. If you're wearing armor, you can soak up as much damage as you want to from a sword because swords can't hurt armor unless you start to target the weak points in the armor and jab up and in. But any strike that you do against armor just isn't gonna do anything. This isn't a video about combat and armor, but when you actually see combat and armor, it's usually with other weapons like war hammers or halberds, or if they are using swords, they're half swording and seeking those gaps. But what you often see in media isn't a depiction of armored combat or harnischfechten. It's a version of blossfechten, which means unarmored combat. And that's usually what people are replicating in RPGs. You wouldn't be swinging a sword at someone with armor because it just wouldn't work.
This is also where we get the trope of cardboard armor. You've probably seen a show or played a game where you can cut through the armor like it's not even there. And this just isn't very realistic. Constitution in unarmored fencing is more about endurance.
Most of the media that we consume around swords and sword fighting, be that video games or TV shows or movies, all are using some form of blossfechten, which is unarmored combat. Even though people in those films are wearing armor, the techniques that they're throwing at each other aren't things that would work against armor. And I think this is one of the places where that misunderstanding about how swords work with Constitution comes from. In a real sword fight, Constitution has nothing to do with how much damage you can absorb, because you can't absorb any. Any hit from this sword would be either fatal or extremely debilitating. You can't even take one.
What Constitution in sword fighting actually looks like is your endurance, your ability to keep going and not tire out, your cardio, how generally fit are you? If you get tired out after 2 hits, you're dead.
And this comes back to strength as well. Not the kind of strength that determines how hard you can hit, but the strength to keep your arms moving, your muscular endurance. So we have different kinds of endurance: cardiovascular, muscular, and also our mental endurance. Because when you're fighting, you can easily get overwhelmed and run out of bandwidth. So you have to stay in the game with your body, with your lungs, and with your head. That isn't to say we never see correct depictions of Constitution in pop culture. In D&D, you might have to do a Constitution saving throw to see if you can complete some arduous or tiring task.
Fencing is also really tiring. Most people don't understand just how truly tiring fencing actually is. One of the most common things we get from newbies is, wow, that was really tiring.
You have to move your body around a lot, and it's gonna tax your cardiovascular system and your muscular endurance like we talked about before. So get to the gym and start getting strong.
At the beginning of the video, we asked the question, which of these is the most important stat?
And the answer is all of them. There are no dump stats in real life. Unlike in an RPG, if you're playing a rogue, you don't really have to worry about your strength, so it can be really low. But in real sword fighting, you need to be strong, fast, and have good constitution. If you're fast but weak, you're not gonna have good structure behind your cuts and you're gonna get blown through on your parries.
Whereas if you're strong but slow, you're not gonna get to do any cuts, you're gonna get picked apart.
And if you have bad constitution, you're not gonna have the muscular or cardiovascular or mental endurance to sword fight for longer than maybe 1 round.
The best example of needing all of the stats is in footwork, the foundational aspect of all martial arts.
Good footwork requires the dexterity to outmaneuver your opponent. It requires the strength to use the chain of the body to deliver strong structured attacks and also withstand your opponent's attacks. It also requires the constitution to keep doing it for a long time and not gas out. Of course, people are going to be better at some things than others. Some people are faster, some people are stronger, some people have more endurance.
But remember, there are no dumb stats IRL. You really do need all three.